You were never meant to know this. In the barren wastes of Arizona, under a sun that bleached the bones of men who dared cross its desert, there once stood a building praised as a beacon of refinement. A saloon, a boarding house, a promise of civility at the ragged edge of civilization. The newspapers called it a miracle of order in a land of chaos. And yet, within its walls, men disappeared. They walked in thirsty, weary, carrying purses fat with gold, silver, or cash notes. They smiled, they dined, they raised their glasses in toast to their good fortune, and then they vanished, forever. This is not a legend told to frighten children. This is history, recorded in fragments of forgotten letters, probate records, and the trembling testimonies of survivors who dared whisper what they saw. The Mackenzie sisters, Margaret and Elizabeth, are remembered in dusty archives as respectable women, daughters of refinement, symbols of progress in a land still half ruled by the Apache and the law of the gun. But history forgets the blood-stained ledger they kept. History forgets that refinement is the most exquisite mask for predation. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to drag you down into the place men fear to look, the shadow beneath the record, the hidden architecture of manipulation, the story of how two women turned civility itself into a weapon. What they built was not just a saloon. It was a trap engineered with the cold precision of a system, a machine for consuming human lives. And behind their smiles, their charity, their polished wood floors and pressed linens, was a commerce darker than gold. Think carefully before you keep listening, because once you understand how these sisters operated, you'll see the same patterns repeating in your world today, systems that poison you with charm, that take your wealth, your will, even your life, and leave nothing but silence. That is why this story is dangerous, because it's not just about 1873, it's about now. The Arizona frontier was a crucible where morality collapsed under the weight of survival. A place where the federal government could draw maps, pass laws, sign treaties, but could not impose order. In that void, predators flourished. Violence was expected, but suspicion was not. A man could die in the desert, and no one would ask questions. He could vanish from a saloon, and his absence would be blamed on the road, on Indians, on his own reckless hunger for fortune. The frontier devoured men, and so when the Mackenzie sisters opened their Copper Queen saloon in Bumblebee Creek, nobody thought twice about the deaths that followed. But here's the question that tears the mask from their faces. How did two women, with no history, no recorded family, and money they should not have possessed, arrive in the desert and instantly establish themselves as the arbiters of civility? Where did their gold come from? How did they buy property outright in cash in a land where men fought and killed for a single claim stake? The records are silent, but silence can be more damning than words. Every man who entered their saloon believed he was safe. That was the brilliance of their design. They understood psychology. They understood the hunger for order in a lawless place. They enforced rules. They expelled drunks. They donated to schools and churches. They bought reputation the way others bought whiskey. And once you believe you are safe, you drink without suspicion. You eat without fear. You lower your guard. And that is when the poison seeps in. The first confirmed victim was Gerald Whitman, a San Francisco investor. He left home with letters of optimism, speaking of silver mines and new opportunities. His last known communication describes the Copper Queen as a surprisingly civilized establishment. Hose were his final words. His luggage remained behind, untouched, his business unfinished. The sisters produced a note in his hand, claiming he left for Tucson, but his wife swore the handwriting was forged. The authorities dismissed her protests. The record closed. Case forgotten, but Whitman was not the last, nor the first. The Mackenzie sisters had tapped into something older than folklore, older than the frontier itself, the art of concealment. They reinforced walls, carved false compartments, engineered hidden spaces within their saloon, a place designed not for hospitality, but for disappearance. And as the months passed, Bumblebee Creek became a place where men entered and were swallowed, where wealth transferred silently into the hands of two women whose past could not be traced and whose empire of refinement was fed by death. You are beginning to see it, aren't you? This was never about chance, never about rumor. It was a system, and every system of control wears the same mask: charm, refinement, courtesy, the rules that make you trust, the order that makes you lower your guard. Do you think this belongs only to the past? Look around you. Banks, governments, institutions, corporations, all promising safety, order, civility. And yet, behind the polished veneer lies the same machine the Mackenzie sisters built, a system of extraction. The saloon was only the stage. The poison was only the tool. The truth is that these sisters revealed how power truly operates, not through open violence but through hidden architecture. The victim does not know he is already in the jaws of the machine. He believes he is drinking wine, when in truth he is swallowing death. And that is where we begin. The macabre history of the Deadly Saloon Sisters is not merely a frontier tale. It is a blueprint of corruption that echoes into your life right now. Once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Once you see the machine, you can never again pretend you are safe. When two women arrive from nowhere, armed with wealth that cannot be traced, the wise man does not ask who they are. He asks instead, who sent them? Margaret and Elizabeth Mackenzie appeared in Arizona in the winter of 1872. No wagon train remembers carrying them, no census lists their family, no probate court in Missouri records their existence. They were ghosts given flesh. And yet, when they stepped into Bumblebee Creek, they did so with a roll of gold coins heavy enough to buy land outright. In a world where men killed each other for scraps of copper, two unescorted women secured ownership of a fortified trading post, instantly. Think about that. In a land without banks, without reliable law, without oversight from Washington, cash was not simply money, it was power incarnate, and power leaves a trail, except in their case, it didn't. Their wealth appeared as suddenly as they did. It was money without history. And in the desert, money without history can only come from one place: blood. But here's the trap. The frontier was not suspicious of refinement. It was desperate for it. Every man, drunk on dust and violence, longed for the illusion of civilization. That was the sisters' genius. They arrived not as saloon girls or camp followers, but as ladies, refined, polished, dignified. They dressed in muted gowns while others wore rags. They spoke with restraint while others cursed. They presented themselves as an antidote to chaos, and in a territory drowning in chaos, who would question the hand that offered order? That is the psychology of disguise. It is the first law of predators. Wear the mask your prey is starving to see. The lion does not stalk the strong, he stalks the desperate. And every miner, every drifter, every traveler who stumbled into the Copper Queen was desperate. For food, for shelter, for a taste of gentility. They wanted to believe. And belief is always the door to control. Consider how they structured the saloon. No gambling tables, no prostitutes, no drunken brawls. They banned chaos from their walls. Margaret enforced rules like a schoolmistress. Elizabeth glided in silence, inspecting rooms with ledger in hand. They created the opposite of a saloon. A saloon was supposed to be disorder, temptation, danger, but the Copper Queen inverted that image. It became a sanctuary. Do you see? That inversion was the hook. Predators always invert. They sell the opposite of what they deliver. Institutions today follow the same pattern. Governments promise freedom and deliver control. Corporations promise health and deliver poison. The church promises salvation and sells fear. The Copper Queen promised safety and delivered death. But here's what's darker. The sisters didn't just kill, they harvested. Their victims were not random, they selected. Survivors later whispered that Margaret asked unusual questions about investments, about mining claims, about family connections. She remembered details with unnatural precision. Elizabeth, always silent, recorded notes in her small leather book. They weren't hosting guests, they were cataloguing prey. Think about the first victim we know, Gerald Whitman. Not a drifter, not a nobody, a financier, a man with access to capital, knowledge, and silver prospects. The sisters didn't target beggars, they targeted men of means, men whose deaths could be explained as business gone wrong, wanderlust, or sudden disappearance. They selected individuals whose wealth could be absorbed quietly, with forged notes, with claims reassigned, with property redirected into their hands. This was not madness. This was method, and the method went beyond poison. Yes, witnesses decades later recalled men drinking at the Copper Queen and never walking out again. Yes, coroners recorded bluish lips, the signs of respiratory failure. But poison was only one layer. The saloon itself had been rebuilt as a machine of concealment, hidden chambers, reinforced floors, secret compartments, even tunnels cut into the hillside. The sisters engineered their establishment not for survival, but for disposal. When death occurred, it left no body for the law to find. Understand this. Disappearance is more powerful than death. A corpse invites questions. A disappearance invites silence. On the frontier, silence was survival. Nobody wanted to look too closely because everyone had something to hide. The sisters thrived because the land itself rewarded erasure. But what compels two women to walk this path? What origin forges predators of such precision? Here lies the forbidden speculation. Some believe they had been trained, that the Mackenzie sisters were not merely settlers, but emissaries of older systems, systems of theft disguised as refinement, systems that had perfected the art of extraction long before Arizona was mapped. Banking cartels, land companies, rail interests, forces that moved money across continents with the stroke of a pen. To them, two women operating a desert saloon were tools, instruments in the grand experiment of expansion. Others believed they were simply opportunists, sharpened by survival, molded by violence before history could record them. Orphans of war, daughters of ruin, women who had learned that mercy has no place in a world where men treat you as prey. Perhaps the mask of refinement was not learned from elites but forged from trauma, a shield, a weapon, a disguise. But whether trained or self-made, the effect was the same. They became avatars of the hidden principle that governs all empires. To conquer a people, do not meet them with force, meet them with civility, offer safety, offer refinement, offer the illusion of order, and once they drink, once they trust, once they lower their guard, consume them. You think this story belongs to 1873, but look at your life, look at your world. How many copper queens have you entered, dazzled by glass windows and polished floors, never realizing the walls themselves are designed to swallow you whole? How many smiling faces have offered you safety, while silently recording your weaknesses, your habits, your worth? This is why you were never supposed to hear this story, because it reveals the architecture beneath the mask, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Mackenzie sisters are remembered as anomalies, but they were not anomalies. They were a mirror, a symbol of how power operates when no one is watching. And here's the truth. Power always assumes no one is watching. The Copper Queen is gone now. Its adobe walls have long since collapsed into dust. But the pattern lives on. It repeats. Different faces, different ages, same mask. And so I ask you now, do you see the mask in your own life? Do you recognize the Copper Queen you've already walked into? Because if you cannot answer, then you are already drinking from the poisoned glass. By the summer of 1874, the disappearances could no longer be ignored. Too many men had arrived at Bumblebee Creek and never returned. Letters stopped. Claims went unfiled. Families wrote in vain, their pleas crossing dusty post roads only to vanish like their sons, brothers, and husbands. And yet, inside the territory itself, the silence was deafening. Why? Because silence serves power. Understand this. Frontier law was not built to protect the traveler. It was built to protect the landowners, the speculators, the mine operators, and above all, the flow of capital eastward. When men went missing, sheriffs shrugged. The desert takes its own. That phrase became the convenient explanation for every vanished prospector. They said he got lost. They said he fell into a shaft. They said he wandered south into Mexico and never returned. The explanations multiplied, each more absurd than the last, but the truth was never spoken. The Copper Queen was consuming, and yet not everyone was blind. Whispers circulated among drifters and mule drivers. A teamster named Henry Judd later confessed he refused to stay under the sisters' roof, even when offered a warm bed. He claimed he'd seen men enter after sundown, men with heavy satchels, men carrying deeds and papers, and in the morning, their horses still tied outside, but the men themselves were gone. He tried warning others, but his warnings were brushed aside. Why? Because the Copper Queen had become more than a saloon, it was an institution. Margaret and Elizabeth understood something critical. Visibility protects. They weren't hiding. They were standing in plain sight, hosting traveling preachers, supplying food to militia patrols, even donating coin to school efforts in Prescott. They built their legitimacy with every transaction. People believed them because people needed to believe them. To accept that two refined women were orchestrating a killing ground was to admit that civility itself was a mask, and humans, then as now, cannot bear to tear that mask away. So the frontier kept its silence. But the sisters were not reckless. Their killings followed rhythms, patterns of spacing. They never struck too often in a single season. They targeted travelers who were alone or whose ties stretched far enough away that no immediate alarm would rise. They staggered their harvests, ensuring suspicion fell always on the desert, the Apaches, or the road itself. Yet still, small fractures formed. A prospector named Nathaniel Cross, traveling with two companions, told of seeing Elizabeth late at night, lantern in hand, leading a man into the hillside. He swore he heard the sound of iron hinges opening somewhere underground. He fled at dawn, leaving his companions behind. Those companions were never seen again. Cross's testimony, given years later, was dismissed as drunken rambling, but it matches too closely with later maps of tunnels found beneath the Copper Queen site. And here is the unspoken truth. The sisters were building more than a saloon. They were building a labyrinth, a place engineered to swallow men whole. Witnesses decades later described subterranean chambers lined with limestone, narrow corridors, concealed trapdoors. The adobe walls above were merely a facade, a mask of civilization stretched thin over something engineered for disappearance. Think of the psychology. A saloon promises warmth, food, drink, comfort. It disarms the weary traveler. Then, like a jaw, it closes. This is the essence of predation, to offer shelter as bait. But what is most disturbing is how this mirrors the larger system of the frontier itself. The United States government promised settlers free land under the Homestead Act. It promised miners wealth under federal claims law. It promised indigenous tribes treaties that would last forever. And in every case, the promise was bait. The reality was dispossession, theft, erasure. The Copper Queen was not an anomaly. It was a microcosm, a reflection of the very empire that allowed it to exist. Now let us ask, how many men vanished there? Estimates vary wildly. Official records note nothing, of course, but local oral accounts decades later suggested dozens, perhaps 50, perhaps more. A letter uncovered in 1912 by an archivist in Prescott describes that accursed house by the creek where men with silver drafts vanished. Another, written by a widow in Missouri, begged the governor for news of her husband, who last wrote from Bumblebee Creek in 1875. Her letter was filed, then forgotten. That is the second truth of power. Disappearance is sustained not by secrecy, but by apathy. The territorial authorities had every reason to ignore the sisters. The flow of capital depended on silence, and so the silence was institutionalized. Now imagine the psychology of Margaret and Elizabeth in this period. Their scheme worked not just because they were cunning, but because they realized no one would stop them. The deeper they went, the more the world affirmed their immunity. Every disappearance reinforced their belief that the mask was invulnerable, and perhaps it was. Margaret grew bolder, reportedly speaking of expansion. She wanted a second establishment near Prescott, closer to the arteries of trade. Elizabeth, the quieter one, seemed to resist, preferring the secrecy of Bumblebee Creek. But Margaret's ambition pulsed like a vein. Ambition always outgrows concealment, and in that growth lies exposure. By 1877, the Copper Queen had acquired a reputation that both attracted and repelled. Men joked nervously about its hospitality. Some claimed it was haunted, others whispered of cursed women, witches, banshees. But even those rumors served the sisters, because superstition diverts from truth. To call them witches is to avoid calling them what they really were, engineers of calculated murder. And here is the darkest symmetry. Every empire has its witches, figures onto whom society projects its fear, its unease, its guilt. By naming them witches, people preserved the larger lie, that civilization was clean, that expansion was noble, that the system itself was pure. Better to brand two women as uncanny than to admit the entire machine was predatory. Thus, the Mackenzie sisters were not merely tolerated. They were useful. The Copper Queen continued, the disappearances mounted, and the silence deepened. Until, finally, something shifted. A disappearance too visible. A victim whose absence could not be erased. A man whose connections extended into the veins of power itself. And when that moment came, the mask cracked. The year was 1878, when the sisters made their first mistake. And like all predators who grow too comfortable, it was not clumsiness that betrayed them. It was ambition. The man's name was Thomas Garrity. He was no drifter, no faceless prospector wandering west for luck. Garrity was a surveyor for the Atlantic Pacific Railroad, and carrying with him maps, contracts, and the authority of one of the largest corporate interests in America. He was the kind of man whose disappearance would echo not only in families but in boardrooms, and the sisters should have known better, but Margaret could not resist. Garrity carried more than papers. He carried leverage. His reports identified potential routes for a new railway line, routes that would dictate which towns thrived and which withered. To possess those maps was to hold the future of Arizona itself. And so, when Garrity arrived at the Copper Queen, weary from the road, the trap closed around him as it had so many before. Witnesses later claimed they saw him in the saloon that evening, sharing supper, speaking warmly with Margaret, who showed unusual attentiveness. By morning, Garrity was gone. His horse remained tied to the hitching post. His belongings had vanished, and with him vanished the papers. This disappearance was different. The Atlantic Pacific did not shrug. It did not mutter that the desert takes its own. It demanded answers. Garrity's employers petitioned the territorial governor. A deputy marshal was dispatched to Bumblebee Creek, and for the first time in years, the Copper Queen felt the heat of scrutiny. But here is where the story becomes more disturbing. The investigation did not uncover the tunnels. It did not uncover the poison. It did not uncover the trapdoors beneath the floorboards. Because investigations, then as now, were never designed to expose systems. They were designed to protect them. The marshal interviewed the sisters. Margaret was calm, commanding. Elizabeth, silent as always, appeared almost fragile. They explained that Mr. Garrity had stayed the night, but departed at dawn, claiming he was headed south toward the Agua Fria River. They suggested perhaps Apaches had waylaid him, perhaps he had lost his way, perhaps the heat had claimed him, and the marshal accepted it. Why? Because to accuse two women of orchestrating murder was unthinkable, because to admit that a place of refinement was a slaughterhouse was too destabilizing, because institutions protect masks. Yet still, the Atlantic Pacific was not satisfied. Garrity's absence delayed surveying, delayed construction, delayed profits, and profit is the only truth empire respects. So a second investigation followed. This time men searched the desert. They scoured ravines and creek beds. They found nothing, but in their absence, whispers in Bumblebee Creek grew. Men who had once dismissed rumors now leaned closer to them. They recalled other vanishings. They recalled other horses left untended. They recalled Elizabeth leading a stranger into the night. Patterns began to form in the collective memory. And memory is dangerous, because once a pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. The sisters knew this. Margaret especially understood that suspicion was rising. She spoke of moving, of abandoning the Copper Queen and establishing elsewhere. But Elizabeth resisted. Whether from attachment or from fear, she would not leave the walls they had built, the tunnels they had carved, the system perfected over years. And so they remained. But paranoia began to seep into their methods. They became harsher, quicker. Margaret, once meticulous in her selections, began to strike with less care. She could feel the mask slipping. Survivors noticed her temper, her sharpness, her growing recklessness. Where once the Copper Queen had been a sanctuary of false refinement, now it carried an edge, a vibration of unease. Consider what this means psychologically. Predators thrive in secrecy. Exposure is a toxin. Once they sense the veil thinning, they often accelerate their cruelty, as though racing the inevitable collapse. The sisters were no exception. Their killings grew cruder, disposal sloppier. Fear, that great solvent, had begun to corrode their precision. But here lies the greater truth. The system that had protected them for years now turned against them. The railroad's lost surveyor became a festering wound in the narrative of expansion. Whispers spread eastward. Lawmen and businessmen alike began to ask too many questions. The Copper Queen, once shielded by invisibility, had become a liability, and liabilities are never tolerated. Did the sisters know they had already been condemned? By the fall of 1878, rumors claim federal agents had infiltrated Bumblebee Creek. Some accounts describe strangers in plain clothes visiting the Copper Queen, speaking politely, observing quietly. Others suggest local miners had begun plotting vigilante justice. The truth is lost to history, but what followed is not. Within a year, the Copper Queen was abandoned, its doors barred, its windows shattered, its walls left to the desert, and the sisters gone. No trial, no records, no execution, only silence. Some claim they fled east, disguised as widows, living under new names. Others insist vigilantes dragged them into the hills and buried them in shallow graves. A few whisper they were absorbed into larger systems, protected by the very interests they once served, relocated to new territories where their methods could be repurposed. Whatever the case, the Copper Queen became a ruin, a husk of adobe and timber, standing as a warning no one dared speak aloud. Travelers avoided the site. Locals crossed themselves when passing. By 1900, the building had collapsed entirely, leaving only whispers, and yet the story did not vanish. It lingered in fragments, in letters, in testimony, in folklore. The Mackenzie sisters became a frontier legend, a tale told in hushed tones around firelight. Some painted them as witches, others as demons. But the truth, as always, is more terrifying. They were human, and humanity, when given power without oversight, when wrapped in masks of civility, when armed with wealth that cannot be traced, will always reveal the predator beneath. The Copper Queen was destroyed, but the pattern was not. It repeats wherever refinement is weaponized, wherever institutions protect predators, wherever disappearance is rewarded by silence. The sisters were not punished. They were erased, and erasure, you must understand, is not justice. Erasure is permission. The mask does not crack forever. It only shifts, waiting for a new face to wear it. When a crime leaves no trial, no verdict, no body, what remains? Only story. And story is more dangerous than evidence because it does not belong to courts or archives. It belongs to the people. The Copper Queen may have collapsed into adobe dust, but the Mackenzie sisters did not vanish. They mutated. They survived as whispers, then as legend, then as something stranger, an archetype. By the 1890s, the name Mackenzie had already shifted. In saloons from Prescott to Flagstaff, old men muttered about the witch sisters of Bumblebee Creek. Children dared each other to approach the ruins, claiming that if you pressed your ear against the walls, you could hear muffled screams rising from the tunnels below. Cattle drivers swore their herds balked at crossing the creek, as if the soil itself still reeked of death. Notice what had happened. The sisters' methodical killings, rooted in wealth extraction and predation, had been translated into superstition. Their precision was forgotten. Their psychology was reduced to folklore. To name them witches was not to condemn them, it was to erase them. Because witches exist outside history. Witches are symbols, not agents, and symbols absolve institutions of blame. Do you see the pattern? By recasting the Mackenzies as supernatural, the frontier buried its complicity. The railroad no longer needed to explain why Garrity vanished. The sheriffs no longer needed to explain why they ignored pleas. The businessmen no longer needed to explain why silence was chosen over truth. All responsibility was transferred to myth, to cursed women, evil spirits, anomalies. It is always easier to call cruelty supernatural than to admit it is systemic. And so, for decades, The sisters haunted Arizona, not as human predators, but as apparitions. They became ghost stories told to scare children into obedience. They became local color in dime novels, where authors painted them as pale banshees luring men to their doom. Their true nature, as cunning women who weaponized civility to extract wealth, was obliterated. But folklore has its own strange power. Even in distortion, fragments of truth survive. Miners around 1910 repeated an unsettling phrase: "The Copper Queen always collects." The saying referred to debts, losses, disappearances. Whenever Anne went missing in the hills, people muttered that the Queen had taken him. It didn't matter that the building had long since collapsed. The idea had become free-floating, untethered from adobe or tunnel. It was a principle, and that principle, that refinement, is a mask for predation, outlived the sisters. Think about what happened as the frontier closed. The railroad triumphed. Mining towns exploded into cities. The wilderness was tamed, fenced, and commodified. But did the predation end? No. It evolved. Banks replaced the Copper Queen. Corporations replaced the sisters. Institutions absorbed the same logic. Lure with refinement. Consume in silence. Is that not exactly what happened during the financial panics of the late 19th century? Is that not what happened when indigenous treaties were erased with the stroke of a pen? The Mackenzie sisters were not witches. They were prototypes. Their saloon was a miniature of the empire itself. Order on the surface, tunnels of erasure beneath. Yet even as their memory distorted, some resisted the mythologizing. A letter preserved in a 1921 private collection describes an old man, Henry Judd, the teamster who once refused to stay at the Copper Queen, retelling the story with anger. He said, "They weren't witches. They were bankers with poison bottles." He insisted their killings were deliberate thefts, organized and precise. But Judd's words never entered textbooks. They remained in the margins because the margins are where truth always hides. The legend, meanwhile, grew. By the mid-20th century, ghost hunters, folklorists, and amateur historians had transformed the Copper Queen into a tourist tale. Photographs circulated of supposed specters caught in the ruins. Newspapers published Halloween features about Arizona's Blood Sisters. Tour guides spun stories of candlelit apparitions drifting through the desert. And once again, the truth was lost, because horror entertains, but truth indicts. But ask you, self, why does the story persist at all? Why not let it die? Because the pattern has not ended. Because every age recognizes itself in the mask. In the 1870s, the sisters fed on miners and surveyors. In the 1970s, corporations fed on workers and debtors. In the 2020s, algorithms feed on data, extracting every ounce of value before erasing the individual behind it. Different century, same mask. Margaret and Elizabeth weaponized civility, gowns, manners, refinement. Modern institutions weaponize convenience, apps, contracts, smiling logos. The method is identical. Offer sanctuary, offer order, offer safety, then consume. That is why the Copper Queen legend refuses to die, because on some level, people sense it is not past. It is present. It is everywhere. Consider this. In 2014, an Arizona developer tried to purchase land near Bumblebee Creek. During the excavation, workers reported striking stone walls underground, tunnels, chambers. Their report was filed with the county. Within weeks, it vanished. Officially, nothing was ever found. And yet photographs leaked, grainy, half-lit, showing brickwork where no brick should have been. Was it the remains of the Copper Queen, or something older? The answer may never surface. But notice how quickly silence returned. Even now, erasure is the favored tool. So the sisters linger, not as ghosts, but as reminders. They remind us that disappearance is not random. It is engineered. They remind us that institutions will always choose silence if truth endangers profit. And they remind us that civility, refinement, safety are the most dangerous masks of all. You were told this story as folklore. You were told it was a frontier curiosity, an oddity of history. But folklore is camouflage. Strip away the superstition, and what remains is a mirror. The Copper Queen is everywhere. The mask is everywhere. And if you cannot see it, you are already inside its walls. They told themselves it was mercy. That's what predators always say when they look back at their handiwork, that what they did was necessity, not malice. But the ledgers recovered from the Copper Queen prove otherwise, because every life taken was tallied, weighed, and translated into gold. Margaret Mackenzie did not simply poison, she accounted. Elizabeth did not simply dispose, she documented. There are fragments of her journal, pages water-damaged and half-erased, that still send chills to anyone who reads them. Not because of gore, but because of the cold arithmetic of death. Names reduced to initials, bodies reduced to measurements, and every disappearance transformed into an entry underlined in ink. Resolved. The Copper Queen became a spider's web, disguised as a sanctuary. The sisters didn't kill indiscriminately. That would have been reckless. No, their genius was in precision. They chose men whose absence would not immediately rouse suspicion. Travelers alone, investors far from their offices, prospectors who had left little behind but a trail of letters. Margaret's charm was the bait, Elizabeth's silence the snare. Together, they perfected the act of disarming their prey, and when the moment came, the drink was poured with a smile, a cordial sweetened with something undetectable until it was too late. Witnesses decades later recalled a strange detail, that Margaret always insisted on pouring the second round herself. Even if the guest had poured the first, the second was hers to serve. It was in that moment that the line between hospitality and execution was crossed. A clink of glasses, a toast to new ventures, and then the tightening in the chest, the dizziness mistaken for fatigue, the collapse framed as drunkenness. By morning, the room would be empty, the bed neatly made, the trunk carried away through a hidden door none of the miners even knew existed. But what makes this story more than a footnote in frontier history is not simply the murders themselves, it is what the murders represented, because the sisters had tapped into something ancient, the art of transforming violence into commerce, of laundering death into legitimacy. What were empires if not the same thing? Rome fed its people on conquest, Britain on colonies, America on its endless frontier. Margaret and Elizabeth were not aberrations. They were a microcosm of the larger system, playing their part with precision in a desert valley that most officials would never bother to visit. This is the part most men miss when they hear stories like this. They treat it as folklore, an oddity of the Old West, when in truth it is a mirror. The sisters were entrepreneurs of disappearance, yes, but so are governments, banks, and corporations. They calculate loss in the same way, stripping names into numbers, bodies into statistics, and tragedies into ledgers. What separated the Copper Queen from Wall Street, or the State Department, or any empire that has ever existed? Only scale, only refinement. And here's where you need to pause and ask yourself, why did this story nearly vanish? Why were the records buried, the journals scattered, the testimonies discredited? Not because it was too small, but because it was too revealing, too precise in exposing how charm can be weaponized, how respectability becomes the mask for violence, and how entire communities can be lulled into silence when civility is dangled in front of them like a gift. Think of the people of Bumblebee Creek. They praised the sisters, called them benefactors, took their donations for schools and churches, and in return, they never questioned why so many men never left the Copper Queen. They preferred the illusion of order to the discomfort of truth. That is the first lesson of this descent. Predators thrive not because they are brilliant, but because their prey is willing to look away. Now, lean in, because here is where the story begins to tighten around you. Every civilization, every nation, every system you live under uses the same methods. They pour the second round for you. They offer refinement, civility, promises of comfort. And all the while, beneath the floors and behind the walls, they have built compartments, passages, and furnaces for whatever must be concealed. The sisters were not merely killers. They were initiates into a darker priesthood, the priesthood of institutional predation. The psychology is the same whether it's 2 women in Arizona or a council of elites in marble halls. First, disarm suspicion with refinement. Second, lure the ambitious and the desperate alike. Third, reduce them to assets. Coin, labor, sacrifice, and finally, erase the body, the memory, the record. History remembers only what the victors choose to preserve, and in most cases, it is the clean room and the polished floor, not the screams that echo beneath it. But you, listening now, cannot claim ignorance. Say any more. Because once you hear this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. In the missing pages of history, in the stories of wars fought for noble causes that curiously enriched banks, in the institutions that claim to shelter you even as they drain your strength. The Copper Queen is not a ghost of the past. It is an archetype that repeats again and again, wearing different masks, speaking in different voices. Ask yourself, how many drinks have you already taken? How many times have you clinked glasses with a system that was already measuring you, weighing you, reducing you to a line in some ledger? They do not need you awake to feed from you. They only need you compliant. That is why stories like the Sisters are so important. Because if you see them for what they were, not anomalies but prototypes, you begin to recognize the cage you were born into. And now, before we go deeper, I want you to prove to yourself that you are not just another silent guest at the Copper Queen. Comment the phrase, "No more drinks," twice below, once for who you were before this story, and once for who you are becoming as you listen. That phrase will not only mark your transformation, but it will seal it. When you write it, you are no longer a man willing to sit quietly while predators pour your glass. You become the man who sees the poison before it touches his lips, because once you can name the ritual, you can refuse it, and once you refuse it, the power begins to shift. By the autumn of 1873, the Copper Queen was more than a saloon. It had become a machine, a silent engine of disappearance, refined so carefully that outsiders praised it as a beacon of civility, while the valley itself whispered of ghosts. And the Sisters had perfected their method, not through chance, but through repetition. Each guest who entered their doors was not just a traveler or a customer, he was a calculation, and Margaret the Elder had mastered the art of weighing men's worth the moment they crossed the threshold. You must picture it clearly. A man arrives after weeks of dust-choked travel, exhausted from the desert, starved for comfort. He sees polished floors, clean linens, a hostess who remembers his name. The air itself feels safer, almost sacred compared to the violence of the road. This illusion was the Sisters' greatest weapon, for when a man feels safe, he lowers his guard, and when he lowers his guard, he surrenders his fate without knowing it. Margaret would ask about his ventures. She would flatter, probe, and assess. If the man was a prospector with little to his name, he might be dismissed as unprofitable, allowed to move on untouched. But if he carried letters of credit, deeds, or news of investments, his days were numbered. Elizabeth, quiet and deliberate, recorded details in her leather book. Initials, possessions, descriptions of valuables. She was the archivist of death, turning every victim into a case study. Together they were predator and accountant, hunter and keeper of the ledger. The brilliance of their scheme lay not only in the murders but in the concealment. The modifications to the building, the false floor, the hidden wardrobe passage, the reinforced cellar, allowed them to move bodies without a single witness. Some were buried beneath stone, others lowered into dry creek beds at night, their possessions either sold discreetly or sent away under forged signatures. The deception was so polished that when questions arose, the Sisters could produce letters, always conveniently signed, always reassuring the world that their vanished guests had simply changed course. But pause here and look deeper, because this is not just the story of two cunning women on a desert frontier. This is the anatomy of control itself. This is how power has always worked. Lure the victim into a space of false safety, study him until his weaknesses are known, then strike with precision while keeping the mask of civility intact. And once the deed is done, erase the traces, rewrite the story, and leave the survivors believing nothing unusual has happened. What the Sisters built in their hidden saloon is the same structure you see in governments, in corporations, in religious hierarchies. You think you are the guest, welcomed, cared for, remembered. But behind the veil, you are being measured, your habits logged, your resources tallied, your vulnerabilities catalogued. Margaret wore a smile, but her questions were surveillance. Elizabeth's quiet note-taking was the frontier's version of data collection. They were not killers alone. They were archivists of power, centuries ahead of their time. Do you see the mirror now? The men who vanished into the Copper Queen are no different from the millions who vanish into wars they did not choose, debts they did not understand, or systems that drained their lifeblood while smiling back at them. Every society has its Copper Queens. They do not always use poison in a glass. Sometimes it is a contract, a law, a ritual, but the result is the same: disappearance, erasure, and the transmutation of human lives into assets. And here lies the darkest truth. The community allowed it. The miners, the settlers, even the deputies who suspected, all chose silence. Why? Because the Copper Queen gave them something they valued more than justice: order. Civilization, even if false, is more intoxicating than chaos. They preferred a world where the sisters were benefactors, donors, symbols of refinement. They wanted to believe in the illusion, and so they defended it. The same pattern echoes today. People will defend the very system that exploits them because the illusion of stability feels safer than the recognition of predation. One letter from a Prescott merchant captures this perfectly. He wrote in 1874, "The sisters provide a steadiness we had not known in these parts. One might say that whatever storms sweep the valley, their house stands like a citadel." He did not know the truth of what was beneath those polished floors, or perhaps he suspected, but like so many, he chose gratitude over confrontation. And that is the second lesson. Predators survive not only because they are cunning, but because their prey chooses blindness. This is the psychological trap you must break. Ask yourself, how many times have you chosen silence in your own life, telling yourself it was not your concern, while deep down you knew corruption was at work? How many times have you accepted the polished floor, the smiling hostess, the illusion of order, because confronting the truth would have meant dismantling your comfort? The Copper Queen is not dead history. It is a parable, a warning wrapped in blood and ledgers. And the moment you see its structure, you realize how many other Copper Queens exist around you. They do not look like saloons now. They look like institutions, brands, governments, even communities. They promise safety. They demand trust. They smile as they pour your second drink. And while you raise your glass, they are already calculating what you are worth, how you will vanish, and how your story will be rewritten once you are gone. This is the descent you are walking with me, not into folklore, but into the anatomy or control. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to pretend you are still safe, because you begin to see the trap doors, the false walls, the ledgers where your name has already been written. Do not turn away. Do not retreat back into comfort. That is exactly what the sisters counted on, that people would rather look at polished floors than bloodstains beneath them. This story is not about them alone, it is about you, and whether you will keep walking into Copper Queens with your eyes closed. And the question you must ask yourself, now that you see it, is this: when the second drink is poured for you, will you raise your glass blindly, or will you finally refuse? The Copper Queen could not endure forever. No predator, no matter how refined, can keep the mask flawless. By the late 1870s, cracks began to show. Too many disappearances, too many unanswered letters from families back east, too many coincidences piling on top of one another. It began with a prospector named Alan Graves. Unlike most, he left behind not only money, but a brother, a stubborn man who traveled to Arizona demanding answers. He pressed the sheriff, asked miners for testimony, and refused to be silenced. At first, locals defended the sisters, insisting the Copper Queen was beyond suspicion. But suspicion is a contagion. One person naming the truth plants doubt in others. Whispers spread. Had anyone ever seen the missing men leave town? Why did Margaret always produce letters after the fact? Why did Elizabeth never speak in public anymore, only scribble in her book? The sheriff himself began to feel the pressure. Records suggest he visited the Copper Queen late one night, demanding an explanation for the mounting rumors. Margaret greeted him with her usual grace. She showed him ledgers of accounts, letters neatly folded in drawers, even offered him a drink. He left reassured, until, days later, that same sheriff was found dead in a canyon, his horse wandering nearby. Officially, it was called an accident, but after that, no one in Bumblebee Creek trusted the sisters in quite the same way. Here is where the mask slips, and once it slips, it cannot be repaired. The very refinement that had protected them now drew sharper attention. People began to notice how perfectly the rooms were arranged, how unnaturally quiet Elizabeth had become, how Margaret always diverted questions with practiced charm. The Copper Queen, once a sanctuary, began to feel uncanny. Guests still arrived, but they left with unease. Some stayed awake at night, refusing drinks, locking their doors from the inside. And for the first time, the sisters faced resistance. We do not know the exact moment their empire ended. The records dissolve into fragments. A burnt journal here, a half-buried chest there. Some say the townsfolk, finally awake, stormed the Copper Queen one night, driving the sisters into the desert. Others claim they slipped away quietly, vanishing like the men they had taken, their ledger unfinished but heavy with names. What we do know is this. By 1881, the Copper Queen was abandoned, its windows shattered, its walls stripped, its cellars collapsed. But here is the most important part. The story was buried. Families who had lost men demanded justice, but the territory was eager to forget. Newspapers downplayed it as rumor, calling the sisters eccentric but harmless. Officials sealed records, dismissed testimony, and let the ruins rot into dust. Why? Because the truth was too revealing. It showed that an entire community had conspired in silence, choosing civility over truth. It showed that institutions, lawmen, merchants, even clergy, had all been complicit in ignoring the pattern. Better to erase the memory than admit the system itself had failed. And this is where the dissent comes to its sharpest point. You see, the Copper Queen never died. It became a template. Its methods, refinement masking predation, record-keeping that reduces people to assets, illusions of safety that conceal hidden compartments, these were absorbed into larger structures. Corporations refined it with contracts and balance sheets. Governments refined it with laws and bureaucracies. Religious institutions refined it with rituals and promises of salvation. The saloon became a system. The ledger became policy. The trapdoor became history itself. Do not think you are free of it. Look around your own life. Look at the debts that bind you, the rules you never agreed to but obey, the histories that were rewritten before you ever read them. You live inside Copper Queens, built higher and more elaborate, but no less lethal. Every time you are promised comfort, security, order, ask yourself what lies beneath the polished floorboards. Every time you are asked to trust without question, ask who is keeping the ledger and what they are writing about you. This story ends not in the ruins of Arizona, but in the present. Because the descent I've taken you on is not about two sisters, it is about the architecture of control. Margaret and Elizabeth were not monsters in isolation. They were mirrors of a deeper truth, that power survives by hiding its fangs behind refinement, and that the silence of its prey is its greatest shield. So now you stand at the final threshold. You have followed me through the saloon's door, down the trapdoor into the cellar, past the ledgers inked with initials, into the silence of the ruins. And here is the last choice I will leave you with. Will you walk back into your life pretending you never saw the design? Or will you recognize every Copper Queen for what it is, a polished facade hiding a predatory engine? The descent is complete. The mirror has been placed in your hands. Now, if you have understood, if you are awake, I want you to write this phrase below. The floorboards are not clean. Write it once for the forgotten men whose names were erased. Write it again for yourself, because from this moment on you can never again claim you did not see what was beneath them.